saying, va 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 va, right? You know, I've been so impressed this evening listening to these presentations, listening to the work of AICS, and it reminded me of a story I once heard about a tourist who goes to India. And he does the normal things. He goes to the Taj Mahal, he's looking at the beautiful structure, and he says to his tour guide, wow, now I've seen the real India. And the tour guide said, no, Saab, you haven't seen the real India. If you want to see the real India, let me show you. So he takes the tourist to his small village, and in a compound in the middle of an apartment complex, he says, sir, sit here. Spend a few hours and observe what's going on. And you see people hanging their laundry up on the walls, and you see children running around. And the tour guide says to the tourist, see that little boy over there? I want you to watch him today. And when I come back in a few hours, I want you to tell me if you can figure out who his mother is. So the tourist sits down and he observes, and the little boy runs around and plays, and when he falls and he scrapes his knee, he runs into one apartment, and a woman comes out and she comforts him, and she wipes away his tears, and she cares for him. And then he's back running, and soon it's lunchtime, he goes into another apartment, and yet another woman feeds him lunch. And soon enough, he's feeling sleepy, so he goes to yet another apartment and falls asleep. And this goes on all day until the tour guide finally returns and asks the tourist, can you tell me now who is this boy's mother? And the tourist says, well, it's been very confusing. There are a lot of women here who seem to be responsible for taking care of this child, but I guess if I had to make a hypothetical guess, I would pick the woman whose house he went to go sleep in. That must be his mother. And the tour guide said, no, that boy is my child and his mother's out of town. That is the spirit of India. The idea that it takes a village to raise a child is exactly what you're demonstrating here in Montgomery County. You've created such a village. You've created what we call samaj. The very essence of community is that we all take care of one another. And we don't do it through having fancy medical degrees or the best social media or the most expert people in the room. We do it by having a simple humanity within ourselves that says, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, I am responsible for the person next to me. And I applaud you for that. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I commend AICS for doing it. You know, as I look at this room, it reminds me a lot of my childhood growing up in Central Texas. I sat in a lot of rooms like this, in Indian American community functions. You'd have catered food on the side, people would dress in their finest on a Saturday night. It was a way to socialize. And I always think about it as an immigrant community, as Dana mentioned. How did we get here? What is the history of how communities like this form? And I once asked my dad, I said, how did we end up in Central Texas of all places? I come from a town of 50,000 people. My mom and dad are physicians. They came here in 1972, and we immigrated to Boston. That was our first port in the United States. And a few years later, we were in Texas. And my dad said, well, it was too cold in Boston. And after the blizzard of 1978, my mom said enough was enough. So my dad took out a map of the US and he drew a line, and he said, we're only going to live below this line. Within a week, he was interviewing for jobs in Florida and California and then in Texas. And when he got to Texas, he did his job interview, and then he had a few hours to kill. So he did what I guess was common back in 1978-9, which is he opened the phone book and he started looking for the last name Patel and Mehta. Well, good try. And he found one and he cold called. I mean, this is what they did. They picked up the phone, he called, he said, hi, I'm Vijay Mehta, I'm a physician from Boston, I'm interviewing for a job, and I'm new in town, could you help show me around? And the person on the other end of the phone said, yes. I find this shocking. Can you imagine if somebody called you at home tonight and said, I'm new in town, will you show me around?
Yeah.
So, short of this, and this person who answered the phone, Manjula Patel, is to this day my mom and dad's best friend. And that's how we ended up in Central Texas. And that was the nature of how communities formed back then. So fast forward, a few years later, my dad said, well, it was to the point where, we were so desperate for a familiar face that if you were in the grocery store or in the shopping mall and you saw somebody who looked basically South Asian, you would introduce yourself, you would invite them over for dinner. And then a few years after that, it was only if they were from India. And then a few years after that, only if they were from Gujarat. And little by little, it no longer became interesting. It no longer became a necessity for us to build communities like this. So for me, I moved to Washington, D.C. 16 years ago. I got here on July 4th, 2000, and I came to work for the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And when I got to my office, it wasn't on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It was at 5600 Fishers Lane in Rockville, Maryland. Because little did I understand about how the government works, something may be called the White House, it doesn't mean it's in the White House. It's big government. And so my first job was in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I came and commuted to work, and I remember being so surprised to see very few Indian faces